bastard blood, gladiator heart, and a name Rome could never erase. Rome remembers its emperors. It remembers Augustus, who brought peace after centuries of blood. It remembers Nero, who burned the city and blamed the Christians. It remembers Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, who wrote his meditations while his legions conquered barbarians. Rome remembers its generals, its triumphs, its marble statues standing eternal in forums where slaves once built empires with their bare hands. It remembers the Colosseum, that monument to glory and cruelty, where thousands died so that Rome could be entertained. But it does not remember the child born in chains, the boy raised in dust and filth beneath those same marble columns. The nameless bastard who became a legend, Rome never wanted to acknowledge, but could never truly erase. His story was not written in official chronicles. No senator recorded his victories. No historian carved his deeds into stone. But the slaves remembered, the poor remembered, and in the dark corners of the empire, in taverns and brothels and marketplaces where official history did not reach, they whispered his name like a prayer or a curse, depending on who was listening. This is his story, what remains of it. Pulled from fragments, from whispers, from the kind of truth that survives not in monuments, but in the memories of those who had nothing else to remember. The sands of the Colosseum are cold at dawn, before the crowds arrive, before the blood begins to flow. The air smells of death that has soaked into stone over decades, of animals kept in cages below, of men who know they will die today, but who rise anyway because they have no choice. In that silence, before Rome wakes to demand its entertainment, you can almost hear them, the forgotten ones, the gladiators whose names were never recorded, the slaves who cleaned the arena after each slaughter, the children who were born into this system and who would die in it, generation after generation, their existence mattering only in how it served Rome's appetite for spectacle. He was born in a cell beneath a ludus, a gladiator school on the outskirts of Rome. His mother was a slave, though whether she had been born into slavery or captured in one of Rome's endless wars, no one remembered or cared to ask. She had caught the eye of someone, perhaps a gladiator who visited her in the night, perhaps a guard, perhaps one of the Nestes, the trainers who owned the school and the bodies within it. She never said, or perhaps she said, and no one listened. Because the words of slave women carried no weight in a world built on the backs of people who were legally classified as property. The birth was difficult. She labored through a night while other slaves tried to help with whatever crude knowledge they possessed. No physician was called. Why would one be? She was a slave. The child, if it survived, would be a slave. The empire had no shortage of slaves. If this one died, there would be 10 more tomorrow, captured in Gaul or Germania or Britannia, dragged in chains to Rome to feed the machine that consumed human lives as casually as it consumed bread and wine. But she survived, and the child survived. A boy, small, weak, crying with the thin sound of something that should not have made it through the night, but somehow did. She held him for perhaps an hour before he was taken from her. Not cruelly, not with malice, simply with the casual indifference of a system that did not see them as people. The child would be raised collectively, along with other slave children, fed just enough to keep him alive, worked as soon as he was old enough to carry things or clean things or serve in whatever capacity his small hands could manage. She saw him sometimes, in the years that followed, before she died. He would be carrying water or sweeping the training grounds, and their eyes would meet for a moment, and something would pass between them that was not quite recognition and not quite love, but something older and sadder than both. Then the moment would end, and they would return to their separate survivals, because attachment was dangerous when everything you loved could be taken from you without warning or explanation. No one ever told him who his father was. Perhaps his mother did not know. Perhaps she knew, but understood that naming him would accomplish nothing except making the child dream of a connection that would never be acknowledged. Bastard blood. That was what the other slaves called him when they called him anything at all. Not a name, a classification, a reminder that he was unwanted by gods and men, born from shame, destined for nothing. He grew up among blood and sand. The ludus was a universe unto itself, a small, brutal world where men were turned into weapons and then destroyed for Rome's entertainment. He watched the gladiators train, saw their bodies sculpted by endless repetition of strikes and blocks and movements designed to kill efficiently, heard the crack of wooden practice swords against flesh when someone was too slow or made a mistake, learned that weakness was punished immediately and without mercy, because these men were not being trained to survive, but to die in ways that would please the crowd. At night, he would imitate what he had seen. In corners where no one watched, using sticks or his bare hands, he would practice the movements, the thrust, the parry, the footwork that kept you alive for one more moment. No one taught him, no one encouraged him. He learned the way animals learn, through observation and repetition, and the understanding that knowledge, any knowledge, might be the difference between living and dying. He heard the crowds on fight days, the roar that shook the walls when a gladiator made a kill, the chanting of names, the worship given to men who were still slaves, but who had achieved something rare in Rome's brutal hierarchy. Glory, recognition, the illusion of mattering. He watched gladiators return victorious, covered in blood that was not always their own, and saw how people looked at them with a mixture of awe and fear. And he understood, young as he was, that violence was the only currency that could buy a slave anything approaching respect in this empire built on subjugation. But when people looked at him, there was no awe, only disgust or indifference. The bastard slave child who cleaned stables and carried water, whose existence was so meaningless that most people did not bother to spit on him, because spitting required acknowledgement, and he was beneath even that. He learned to move quietly, to keep his head down, to make himself invisible. These were the survival skills of the powerless, refined over generations of slavery into an instinct as deep as breathing. He was 12 when they sold him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the ludus was being reorganized, and slave children who were not yet profitable needed to be liquidated. He was sold for less than a decent horse would cost, less than a good sword. He stood in the marketplace with other children and adults, all of them chained, while Romans walked past and evaluated them the way one might evaluate livestock, checking teeth, examining muscles, calculating value. The man who bought him was a Neste, an owner of gladiators, who saw something in the boy that others had missed. Perhaps it was the way he stood, silent and watchful. Perhaps it was the hardness already visible in eyes too young to have earned it. Perhaps it was simply that the price was low enough to be worth the gamble. Either way, the boy was taken to a new ludus, chained with other new acquisitions and informed of his new reality. He would be trained as a gladiator. He would fight in the arena. He would almost certainly die there. But if he won enough fights before dying, he might earn the ludus some profit. That was all that mattered. That was all he was. The training was worse than anything he'd experienced. The ludus operated on a simple principle: break the body until it rebuilds itself stronger, break the spirit until nothing remains except the will to survive. They trained with wooden swords heavy enough to build impossible strength. They wore weighted armor until moving felt like drowning. They were beaten for mistakes, starved for weakness, pushed past every limit until limits became meaningless. Many died in training, not in dramatic ways, not in the arena with crowds watching. They simply collapsed one day and did not get up, their hearts giving out or their bodies finally refusing to endure more. These deaths were not mourned. The bodies were dragged away and burned or dumped in mass graves outside the city, and new slaves were brought in to replace them. The machine did not stop. It could not stop. Rome demanded its bread and the circuses required a constant supply of bodies willing or unwilling to die for the entertainment of citizens who would forget their names before the blood was washed from the sand. He survived, not because he was the strongest or the fastest. He was neither. But he had something that many of the others lacked. He had nothing to lose, no family waiting for him, no home to dream of returning to, no past worth remembering, and no future worth imagining. He existed purely in each moment, focused entirely on survival, not because he valued life, but because dying felt like giving Rome what it wanted. And he had learned to hate Rome, with a purity that was almost religious. His first fight came when he was 15. They threw him into a small arena on the outskirts of the city, one of the countless minor venues where new gladiators were tested before being risked in larger, more expensive spectacles. He was given a short sword and a small shield and matched against another boy near his age, a Gaul with red hair and terror in his eyes. The crowd was small but loud, Romans of the lower classes, looking for cheap entertainment, merchants and tradesmen, and off-duty soldiers drinking wine and placing bets on which boy would die and how long it would take. They did not chant names, they shouted bastard and slave and obscenities designed to rile the fighters into recklessness. Death was more entertaining when it came quickly and dramatically. He did not fight like a trained gladiator. He fought like an animal, desperate, brutal, without form or grace. When the Gaul lunged at him, he dodged and struck at the legs, bringing the boy down. When the crowd screamed for the kill, he hesitated, and that hesitation earned him a cut across his ribs that would scar. But then the survival instinct took over, and he drove his sword down through the fallen boy's throat and felt warmth spray across his hands. The crowd roared, not with admiration, with satisfaction. They had paid for blood, and they had received it. The Gaul twitched and died in the sand, and the bastard stood over him, breathing hard, not feeling victorious but empty, hollow, as if something inside him had died along with the boy whose name he would never know. But Rome noticed him. Word spread among the lanistas and betting circles that there was a new fighter who survived when he should not have, who fought without technique, but with something more primal and therefore more entertaining. The ludus began entering him in more fights. Small venues at first, then slightly larger ones. He won, not always cleanly, not always easily, but he won. People began to recognize him, not by name, because no one had bothered to give him one that mattered. They called him the bastard, and sometimes ghost, because of how pale he looked, covered in arena dust, and sometimes just grunted and pointed when placing bets. He became profitable. And in Rome, profitability brought a certain kind of safety. As long as he kept winning, he would be fed, trained, kept alive for the next fight. But he was still a slave, still property, and property could be used in whatever ways the owner deemed profitable. They rented him out to wealthy Romans who wanted to demonstrate their power by owning a fighter for an evening. They offered him to noble women who collected gladiators the way they collected jewelry, as symbols of their status and their ability to control dangerous men. He learned to endure these humiliations with the same blank expression he wore in the arena. This too was survival. This too was part of the price of not dying. He began to notice that he had followers, not among the wealthy Romans who used him, but among the poor, the slaves who came to watch fights on their rare days of rest, the freedmen who remembered what chains felt like. They saw in him something they recognized, someone who had been born with nothing, given nothing, promised nothing, and who kept surviving anyway. They chanted when he fought, not insults, something else. A name they had given him themselves, built from Latin and street slang, that meant something like the unkillable one, or death's refusal. The ludus owner heard about this and saw opportunity. A gladiator with a following was worth more than a gladiator without one. He could be advertised, built up, marketed, so they began to craft a story around him, the bastard who rose from nothing, the slave who could not be killed, the ghost of the arena. It was all manufactured, all performance, but the crowds did not care. They wanted stories, heroes, villains, something to believe in or hate. The truth of his life mattered less than the entertainment value of the fiction. He fought larger opponents, faster opponents, teams of opponents. They matched him against criminals sentenced to death, against captured soldiers from conquered provinces, against animals brought from Africa and made mad with starvation. He survived. Not always unscathed. His body accumulated scars, like a map of every moment he had refused to die. His right shoulder bore the marks of a lion's claws. His left leg carried the memory of a spear that had nearly severed the muscle. His face was marked by a sword that had come within inches of taking his eye. But he survived, and with each survival, his legend grew. People came to the arena specifically to watch him fight, to see if this would be the day he finally fell, to witness what they believed was inevitable. Because no gladiator lived forever, no slave escaped the system that owned him. Death was certain. They just wanted to be there when it happened, to say they had seen the fall of something that had seemed, for a brief impossible moment, like it might actually be eternal. There was a woman, a slave like himself, who worked in the kitchens of the ludus. They did not speak often. Speech was dangerous for slaves, because conversation implied thought, and thought implied humanity, and humanity made it harder for owners to justify the things they did. But sometimes their eyes would meet across the courtyard, and something passed between them that was not quite love, but was the closest thing to it, that could exist in a place where everything could be taken away without warning. He never learned if she felt the same, never had the chance to ask. One day she was simply gone, sold to another household or dead from illness, or moved to a different part of the ludus where he would never see her. No one told him. Why would they? She was property. He was property. What property felt about other property was irrelevant. But her absence carved something out of him that had not been empty before. It was not grief exactly. He had learned too young not to let himself feel grief for losses that were constant and inevitable. It was something colder, a deepening of the understanding that nothing he cared about would ever be allowed to remain. That Rome's cruelty was not just in how it killed, but in how it made sure you understood that anything you loved could and would be used against you. After that, he fought differently, not with more rage, with less, with a kind of mechanical efficiency that was more frightening than emotion would have been. He killed because killing was required. He survived because the alternative was letting Rome win. But there was no joy in it, no satisfaction, only the cold repetition of violence that had become his entire existence. The final fight came on a day when the Colosseum was filled to capacity. The emperor himself was present, which meant the games would be spectacular, exotic, expensive. They had planned something special for the crowd's entertainment, a reenactment of a famous battle. Gladiators dressed as Roman soldiers fighting gladiators dressed as barbarians, animals released to create chaos, condemned criminals used as extras who would be killed to make the spectacle more realistic. He was chosen to lead the barbarian side, not because he was the best fighter, though by then he might have been, but because the story worked. The bastard slave, the unkillable ghost, leading the forces of chaos against Rome's order. The crowd would love it. The symbolism was obvious, and in the end, Rome would win, as Rome always won, and the empire's superiority would be demonstrated once again through choreographed violence. The fight was chaos, dozens of men, animals, weapons, all crashing together in the sand while the crowd screamed. He moved through it like something no longer quite human, striking, killing, moving on. His sword arm was mechanical, his movements were precise. He felt nothing, not fear, not excitement, not even the satisfaction of survival. He was simply executing the function he had been trained to execute. Then something changed. One of the condemned criminals, a man who was supposed to die as part of the spectacle, broke formation, started killing Romans instead of dying quietly as scripted. Others followed. The carefully choreographed battle collapsed into actual combat. Guards moved in to restore order, but the arena had become genuine bedlam. And in that chaos, he made a choice. He did not have to make it. No one would have blamed him for simply surviving as he always had, for letting the guards handle the situation, for retreating to safety. But he moved toward the condemned criminals instead, helped them, fought alongside them, not because he believed they would win. They would not win. This was Rome. The empire did not lose fights in its own arena, but because for one moment, for the first time in his life, he could choose what he fought for instead of simply fighting to survive. The battle lasted minutes. The guards overwhelmed them. The condemned criminals were killed. Most of the gladiators who had joined the unexpected rebellion were killed. He took wounds that should have been fatal, a spear through his side, a sword across his back, injuries that would have dropped a normal man instantly. But he did not drop. He fought until his body simply would not function anymore, until his legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees in the blood-soaked sand, surrounded by the dead, while the crowd screamed and the emperor watched from his box with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something closer to respect. They did not kill him immediately. Perhaps because the emperor found the rebellion entertaining, perhaps because a gladiator who had survived that should not have been alive, and living proof of survival was its own kind of spectacle. He was dragged from the arena, taken to the cells below, and left to die from his wounds because medical treatment was expensive and he was unlikely to survive regardless. But he survived. Again. Impossible as it should have been. His body rebuilt itself slowly, painfully, held together by scar tissue and whatever stubborn force had kept him alive through everything else. The ludus owner came to see him once, looked at him lying in the cell, more dead than alive, and said something that might have been admiration or might have been disgust. "You should be dead. Why aren't you dead?" He did not answer. What was there to say? That he had survived so long he no longer knew how to do anything else? That dying would require effort and he was too tired to make it? That some part of him refused to give Rome the satisfaction? Weeks passed, then months. His wounds healed to the point where he could move again, though pain had become permanent, woven into his body like a second skeleton. They did not put him back in the arena. Perhaps they were afraid of what he represented now. Perhaps they did not know what to do with a gladiator who had fought against Rome instead of for it. Perhaps they were simply waiting for him to die quietly and stop being a problem. The crowd had not forgotten him. In the streets, the poor whispered his name. The slaves spoke of the fight where he had chosen rebellion, even knowing it was futile. He had become something dangerous, a symbol, not of victory because he had not won, but of refusal, of the possibility that even in a system designed to make resistance impossible, someone might still choose to resist anyway. The ludus owner came again one day, looked at him standing in the cell, scarred and damaged but still breathing, and made a decision. "I'm setting you free," he said, not because he had earned freedom, not because Rome had suddenly developed mercy, but because keeping him was more dangerous than releasing him, because the symbol he had become was too volatile to control. They opened the cell door, gave him no money, no possessions, nothing except the understanding that he was no longer property. He walked out into Rome's streets, free for the first time in his life, and felt nothing like joy. Freedom was just another kind of emptiness, another space where he did not belong. He walked through the city, past the Colosseum where he had nearly died, past the forums where his story was not carved in stone, past the temples to gods who had never answered any prayer he might have whispered. People recognized him. Some pointed, some moved away, some nodded with respect they would never have shown to a slave. But none of them spoke to him. What would they say? What words existed for a man who had been born a bastard, lived as a slave, fought as a weapon, and was now something Rome had no category for? He kept walking until he reached the edge of the city, where Rome ended and the rest of the world began. He stood there for a long time, looking out at roads that led to places he had never seen, to provinces and kingdoms and peoples whose names he had only heard shouted by dying men in the arena. Then he walked away, into the world beyond Rome, into anonymity, into a life that was his own for the first time ever, even if he no longer knew what to do with it. No chronicle records what happened to him after. Whether he died on those roads or found some kind of peace in lands where his scars meant nothing, whether he became a mercenary or a farmer or simply wandered until his body finally gave out. The official histories say nothing because he had never mattered to official history, but the slaves remembered, the poor remembered. They told his story to their children, and their children told it to their children, and it became one of those tales that survives not in stone, but in whispers. The bastard who refused to die. The gladiator who fought against Rome in Rome's own arena. The ghost who walked away from the empire that had tried to break him and somehow remained unbroken. Bastard blood, gladiator heart, and a name Rome could never erase, no matter how hard it tried. Because some truths survive despite everything, some stories refuse to die, and sometimes the people history tries hardest to forget are the ones who end up mattering most. Not to emperors or senators or historians writing chronicles that will gather dust in libraries, but to the ones who saw themselves in his refusal, who understood that survival itself could be a form of rebellion, who learned from his life that even when you are born with nothing, promised nothing, given nothing, you can still choose how you die. Or better yet, you can choose not to die at all, not when they expect it, not how they expect it. You can survive out of spite, out of stubbornness, out of the simple refusal to let them win. He was a bastard, a slave, a gladiator, and then, finally, inexplicably, impossibly, he was free. Not because Rome granted it, but because he had survived long enough to take it, and that, perhaps, is the only victory that ever mattered.